Welcome back. Tonight, we're opening a door the Vatican has kept locked for centuries, not to dusty manuscripts or jeweled relics, but to something far stranger. Hidden deep within church whispers are stories of beings the faithful call angels, yet their purpose is not to protect. These are messengers of finality, shadows in the rafters, wings in the dark sent, it said, to carry out heaven's most feared commands. History remembers cathedrals and saints, incense and hymns, but beneath that beauty runs a quieter truth. Faith has always walked beside fear, and some of the church's oldest secrets are written not in scripture, but in death. Before we begin, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy wandering through these hidden corridors of history. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I like to picture us as a scattered circle of night watchers. So, dim the lights, let the room go still, and let's begin. In the heart of the Vatican, behind locked bronze doors and under the constant gaze of Swiss guards, there exists an archive so secret that even many cardinals have never seen its full breadth. This is not the Vatican Library, open to scholars for centuries, but the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, a repository that stretches nearly 53 miles of shelving beneath and around the Apostolic Palace. The oldest records here date back to the 8th century, some written on parchment darkened by time and candle soot. Among the papal bulls, diplomatic letters, and coronation records lie more obscure files accounts written in guarded Latin and coded Italian that speak of visitationes by entities neither entirely condemned nor openly celebrated. One such document, dated to 1623, during the reign of Pope Gregory XV, describes the sudden death of a Benedictine monk within the walls of a cloister in Rome. The room had been locked from the inside, and yet his expression, frozen in wide-eyed terror, suggested he had seen something or someone in his final moments. No weapon was found, no sign of poison, but a margin note, faint but legible, mentioned the phrase alla tacita, the silent wing. The scribe's neat hand gave no further detail, as though the words themselves were dangerous to repeat. The document was never entered into official church history. Instead, it was sealed with red wax and indexed only with an archival code, filed among incidents marked as fide periculum, meaning danger to the faith. For 400 years, this record remained untouched, waiting for a curious eye to uncover what the church could not bring itself to erase, but dared not explain. The year 1623 was one of turbulence both within and beyond the Vatican walls. Pope Gregory XV had ascended to the papal throne only 2 years earlier and was occupied with establishing the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, a body meant to centralize Catholic missionary work. Europe was in the throes of the 30 Years' War, a conflict driven as much by political ambition as by religion. Against this backdrop, the unexplained death of a monk in a Roman cloister might have been dismissed as an isolated misfortune. Yet the way it was handled suggests otherwise. The cloister in question belonged to the Basilica of San Clemente, a site layered over older Roman structures, including a 4th-century church and a Mithraic temple beneath it. Local records preserved in the municipal archives note that witnesses were questioned not by the city guard, but by papal officials. One lay brother recalled seeing a shadow pass across the courtyard moments before the death knell sounded, although the night had been moonless. Another claimed he heard a bell toll, though no one had been in the tower. These statements never appeared in public transcripts but were preserved in the sealed Vatican file. There is no surviving autopsy report, though such procedures were rare in the early 17th century, unless foul play was suspected. The fact that the case was withdrawn from civil jurisdiction almost immediately indicates that the Church considered the matter within its own authority, perhaps because it feared scandal or because it believed the cause was beyond earthly explanation. From that moment forward, the phrase alla tacita began to appear in other internal correspondences, always in relation to sudden and unexplained deaths within church precincts. Whether it referred to an apparition, a metaphor, or a code for something else remains unclear, but the pattern would not go unnoticed by those who kept the Black Ledger. The earliest confirmed appearance of the phrase alla tacita in Vatican records after 1623 occurs in a memorandum dated April 19, 1625. This document, signed by Monsignor Fabrizio Verali, a senior cleric in the Apostolic Palace, describes the passing of an elderly canon attached to the Lateran Basilica. According to the memorandum, the canon collapsed during Compline, the last prayer service of the day, in full view of several other clerics. Witnesses agreed that his death was instantaneous and silent, his prayer book falling closed before it touched the floor. The official explanation, as entered into the basilica's register, was heart failure brought on by age. Yet Verali's memorandum, filed separately in the confidential archive, records two details omitted from the public account. First, a sacristan had reported seeing what he described as a pale brightness, shaped like a bird's wing, pass between the choir stalls moments before the canon's death. Second, a bell in the north tower rang once, though its ropes had been tied off for the night. The Lateran's bells were well maintained, and such an event would have been regarded as highly unusual. There is no indication that Pope Urban VIII, who had succeeded Gregory XV in 1623, addressed the matter personally, but the memorandum bears the seal of the Congregation of the Holy Office, the institution responsible for safeguarding Catholic doctrine and investigating heresy. The fact that the Holy Office retained custody of the file suggests that whatever alla tacita was believed to be, it was not dismissed as superstition. Rather, it was noted as part of an emerging pattern, one in which the Church quietly recorded the presence of a mysterious agent whose appearances coincided with sudden and unexplained deaths in sacred spaces. By 1627, the number of internal references to alla tacita had grown to the point that a separate section of the Black Ledger was devoted to it. This ledger, bound in calfskin and sealed with the insignia of the Camerlengo, was kept under the care of the papal chamberlain. It contained not only Vatican incidents, but also reports from dioceses across Catholic Europe. One such entry came from Avignon, which at that time was still a papal territory. In May of that year, during a procession honoring the feast of Corpus Christi, the city's bishop, Jean-François de Gondi, collapsed without warning as the Blessed Sacrament passed the steps of the cathedral. The crowd erupted in confusion. Yet many later testified to seeing a shadow sweep across the facade moments before. The day had been cloudless, with a mistral wind driving the sunlight clear and sharp through the narrow streets. Local physicians could find no cause for the bishop's death, and the body showed no wounds or signs of illness. Within a week, 2 papal envoys arrived from Rome to collect witness statements. Their notes, preserved only in the confidential register, record the testimony of a choir boy who claimed to have heard a single deep bell tone, though no bells were rung during the procession. Avignon's cathedral bells, tuned in C, could not produce the low resonance he described. That detail would later match similar anomalies in other cases. The bishop was buried with full honors, his death declared an act of divine will. Yet in the Vatican ledger, his name was added beneath the inked phrase, alla tacita, and beside it a single word in Latin, adfuit, meaning was present. The file was then sealed, joining the growing archive of unexplained visitations tied to this silent wing. In 1629, 2 years after the Avignon procession, another entry appeared in the ledger, this time from within the Vatican's own walls. The death occurred in the chapel of the choir inside St. Peter's Basilica, a space reserved primarily for the clergy and papal household. The deceased was Monsignor Paolo Mancini, a senior advisor to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Records confirm he had been in good health, having attended a meeting earlier that day concerning the censorship of a theological manuscript. Witnesses, mostly canons and altar servers, stated that Mancini was kneeling during a quiet interval of prayer when he suddenly stiffened, tilted his head upward as if listening to something, and fell forward without uttering a word. The official death record cited apoplexy, the common term for a sudden cerebral event, but the confidential file includes more troubling details. One altar server claimed that, just before Mancini collapsed, the air above the altar shimmered faintly, as though heat were rising from an unseen source. Another said he heard a soft rustling, not unlike the sound of a robe brushing over marble, though no one else was near the altar. Most strikingly, the basilica's great boredom bell, housed in the campanile, gave a single resonant note at that exact moment. The clock mechanism was inspected immediately afterward and found to be functioning normally. Pope Urban VIII, himself a poet and scholar, was reportedly informed of the event in private, but chose not to pursue it formally. The phrase alla tacita appears once more in the margin, along with a cross mark used in the ledger to denote incidents within the apostolic palace grounds. With yet another death recorded under this heading, the pattern was becoming undeniable to those entrusted with the ledger's keeping. The following year, 1630, brought an incident that extended the reach of alla tacita beyond Rome and Avignon into the territories of the Spanish crown. The report came from Seville, a key center of Catholic power and maritime trade. Archbishop Diego de Guzman had presided over a solemn mass marking the return of a treasure fleet from the Americas. Contemporary civic records confirm that the ceremony took place in the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Sea, the largest Gothic cathedral in Europe. During the final benediction, witnesses claimed a sudden dimming of light within the nave, despite the clear midday sun streaming through the high stained glass windows. Guzman, who had appeared vigorous at the start of the service, faltered mid-blessing, dropped the monstrance, and collapsed before the altar. Official chronicles attribute his death to exhaustion, though his age 64 was not considered especially advanced for clerical service at the time. The confidential Vatican dispatch, however, preserved the accounts of 2 cathedral canons who reported seeing an indistinct form high above the choir screen. Neither bird nor cloud that passed soundlessly across the transept. As with previous cases, the great cathedral bell rang once without any ringer in the tower, producing a low tone inconsistent with the liturgical bells in use during Mass. The papal nuncio in Madrid forwarded the file to the Holy Office in Rome, where it was entered into the ledger under alla tacita, with a notation in partibus Hispania, in the regions of Spain. This marked the first officially recorded appearance of the phenomenon in the Iberian Peninsula and suggested a presence that could manifest far from the Vatican's immediate reach. By now, the ledger's keepers had recorded enough such incidents to suspect that these were not isolated occurrences, but part of a continuing and deliberate pattern. By 1632, the entries tied to alla tacita were no longer confined to sudden deaths of high-ranking clergy during major ceremonies. A case that year in the Tuscan city of Siena involved Father Matteo Corsini, a Dominican preacher known for his outspoken sermons criticizing moral laxity among both lay people and fellow priests. Archival municipal records verify that Corsini's final sermon was delivered on the feast of Saint Catherine of Siena at the Basilica of San Domenico. Eyewitnesses recalled that midway through his address, Corsini paused abruptly, his gaze fixed on a point above the congregation. Several attendees later claimed to have turned to see nothing but an empty section of vaulted ceiling. Moments later, a deep, resonant sound described as a single bell note, lower than the basilica's own bells could produce, rolled through the nave. Corsini's voice faltered, and he collapsed at the foot of the pulpit. Physicians summoned from the local hospital could find no visible cause of death. The Dominican prior, recognizing the possible implications, wrote a detailed account that was hand-carried to Rome by a trusted courier rather than sent through ordinary ecclesiastical channels. The confidential Vatican file records his testimony almost verbatim and includes his reluctant mention of a faint shadow that seemed to glide along the upper gallery just before Corsini fell. This report, now preserved in the ledger, contains the first notation of the phrase signum alarum sign of the wings written beside alla tacita in a different hand, possibly indicating that the phenomenon had acquired a secondary term among those tracking it. This marginal addition hinted at growing unease within certain Vatican offices, suggesting that by the early 1630s, the silent wing was becoming less a whispered curiosity and more a matter of genuine theological concern. In 1634, the ledger records what is considered one of the most unusual and troubling appearances linked to alla tacita. The event took place in Naples, then under Spanish rule, during the feast of San Gennaro. Crowds had gathered in the Cathedral of the Assumption to witness the annual liquefaction of the saint's blood, a miracle celebrated since the late 14th century. According to municipal chronicles, the relic had been displayed without incident when Archbishop Martino de Leon knelt to offer a final prayer. Several witnesses, including members of the cathedral chapter, swore that a sudden chill filled the air despite the summer heat. One chorister claimed the lamps flickered, as though a draft had swept through the building, yet the massive doors remained closed. Moments later, a deep bell tone echoed through the cathedral. Although the official bell ringers stationed in the tower testified under oath that they had not touched the ropes, the archbishop rose as if startled, clutched his chest, and fell before the altar, dying instantly. The public explanation given by the diocesan chancery was heart failure, However, a courier dispatched to Rome carried a sealed report to the Congregation of the Holy Office, noting the presence of a dim silhouette above the reliquary, pale and vast as a low cloud, observed by at least 2 canons. Upon arrival, the document was entered into the ledger under alla tacita, with the annotation ad sacra, at the sacred. This phrasing was rare and suggested that the phenomenon's appearance during a moment of veneration for a saint was viewed with particular gravity. The event's proximity to a public miracle made it even more sensitive, forcing the Vatican to keep the details closely guarded to avoid undermining popular devotion. 2 years later, in 1636, the phenomena resurfaced in Lisbon in circumstances that drew direct papal attention. The Patriarchal Church of St. Vincent, a major religious and political center for Portugal, was hosting a diplomatic mass attended by envoys from the Holy See. The occasion marked renewed negotiations between the Portuguese crown and the Vatican after years of tension. Contemporary civic records confirm the presence of Cardinal Giovanni Battista Pamphile, then papal nuncio to Portugal, and later to become Pope Innocent X. During the Gloria of the High Mass, witnesses recalled a sudden shadow sweeping across the transept, despite the clear morning sun pouring through the clerestory windows. Pamphile himself noted in a private letter preserved among his correspondence in the Archivio Segreto that the shadow was accompanied by an unaccountable sound, like the slow striking of a single, immense bell. Moments after the shadow passed, the Portuguese Archbishop Dom Afonso Furtado de Mendonça collapsed and died where he stood at the altar. His death was officially recorded as apoplexy, yet Pamphile's letter makes specific reference to the term alla tacita and acknowledges prior familiarity with similar events in Rome. This is one of the few surviving documents from a high-ranking Vatican diplomat that openly connects the phrase with a sudden ecclesiastical death. The ledger entry for this incident was annotated with "in conspectu legatorum" in the sight of the legates, indicating that the event occurred before diplomatic representatives. The political sensitivity of a death under such circumstances likely deepened the Vatican's resolve to keep the matter contained within the smallest possible circle of trusted officials. Pamphile's personal testimony will later lend weight to the ledger's credibility, making it harder for skeptics within the Curia to dismiss the phenomenon as a collection of unconnected tales. In 1638, another occurrence of alla tacita was recorded, this time in the city of Antwerp, then part of the Spanish Netherlands. The Church of St. Charles Borromeo, newly consecrated less than a decade earlier and renowned for its Baroque splendor, was hosting a solemn mass for the Jesuit order. Among the celebrants was Father Cornelis Verhoeven, a scholar known for his theological lectures and for his loyalty to the Counter-Reformation cause. Parish records confirm the Mass was well attended by civic leaders and merchants. During the elevation of the host, several congregants reported a dimming of light inside the nave, though no clouds obscured the morning sky outside. One merchant's testimony, later obtained by Jesuit superiors and forwarded privately to Rome, describes a motion in the air, broad and slow, without form yet suggestive of a wing crossing above the altar. Almost simultaneously, a resonant bell tone sounded, deeper than any in the church's tower. Father Verhoeven faltered, spilling the chalice, and collapsed at the foot of the altar steps. He was pronounced dead moments later. The official diocesan statement attributed his death to sudden illness, omitting any reference to the unusual phenomena. However, a separate report from the Jesuit provincial to the general in Rome, preserved today in the Archivum Romanum Societatis, Iesu, noted the similarities to earlier alla tacita incidents. This correspondence was later copied into the Vatican ledger with a notation in Societe Jesu, marking one of the first recorded connections between the phenomenon and the Jesuit order. The presence of prominent civic figures at the Mass increased the risk of rumors spreading, prompting both the local bishop and the Jesuit superiors to handle the matter with extreme discretion. As with previous cases, the pattern of a silent wing and a solitary bell tone was preserved only in the most restricted records. By 1640, the ledger's keepers had grown accustomed to the discreet arrival of sealed packets bearing accounts of unexplained deaths, accompanied by the same quiet markers. That year's most notable entry came from the Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, one of the city's few Gothic churches and a favored site for Dominican ceremonies. On the evening of March 12, during Vespers, Cardinal Francesco Barberini, nephew of Pope Urban VIII and a central figure in papal diplomacy, was in attendance alongside senior members of the Roman Curia. Witnesses agreed that the service was proceeding without incident until the chanting faltered briefly. Several choir members later claimed to have sensed an abrupt stillness in the air, as if all ambient sound had been drawn away. A single bell tone then resonated from somewhere above, though the basilica's tower held no bell of that depth. One of the acolytes, questioned privately by a Dominican prior, described seeing a fleeting silhouette along the clerestory, pale and vast but indistinct. The figure vanished before he could alert anyone. Moments later, Archbishop Lorenzo Bianchetti, who had been standing near the altar, swayed and collapsed, dying before he could be carried to the sacristy. The official record stated natural causes without further elaboration. Barberini, who maintained close ties to the Holy Office, ensured that an unpublicized memorandum of the incident reached the ledger within days. The entry was marked in urbe, indicating an occurrence within the city of Rome itself, and underscored the unsettling fact that such manifestations could appear in the very heart of Catholic power. That a high-ranking cardinal witnessed it firsthand and facilitated its quiet recording only added to the credibility and concern surrounding alla tacita among those few granted access to the Black Ledger. In 1642, the phenomenon emerged far from the centers of Rome or Madrid, appearing instead in Krakow, a major seat of Catholic influence in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The city was hosting a liturgical celebration at Wawel Cathedral for the feast of St. Stanislaus, attended by King Władysław IV Wasa and members of the royal court. The Mass was conducted by Bishop Piotr Gębicki, a key political and religious figure whose loyalty to both Rome and the monarchy was well documented. Contemporary chronicles confirm that the cathedral was filled to capacity, with the royal chapel choir providing the music. Partway through the liturgy, witnesses described a sudden dimness as though a shadow had crossed the high vaults, though the stained glass windows blazed with morning sunlight. A deep single bell tone followed, resonating far below the cathedral's normal register. Almost instantly, Bishop Gębicki halted mid-blessing, gripped the altar rail, and fell. Physicians in attendance could find no sign of injury or illness sufficient to explain the sudden death. Royal guards quickly ushered the king and his entourage from the cathedral, while cathedral clergy moved to shield the body from public view. According to a letter from the Papal nuncio in Warsaw to the Congregation of the Holy Office, the king himself remarked afterward that something unseen passed before us. This correspondence, preserved in the Vatican's diplomatic archives, was later copied into the Black Ledger with the notation "In presentia regis," in the presence of the king. It marked one of the rare occasions where alla tacita manifested before both high ecclesiastical authority and reigning royalty. The involvement of the monarchy ensured the matter was handled with utmost secrecy, and any public mention of unusual circumstances was carefully excised from official funeral accounts. By 1645, the alla tacita entries in the ledger revealed a troubling consistency that few outside the Vatican's most secure offices could see. That year's most notable incident occurred in Cologne, then a key ecclesiastical territory within the Holy Roman Empire. Archbishop Ferdinand of Bavaria, who had governed the electorate of Cologne for over 4 decades, was presiding over a high mass in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Mary. The city's own civic records describe a solemn occasion, attended by noble envoys and senior clergy from neighboring territories. According to the confidential Vatican account, the Archbishop had just begun the Eucharistic prayer when a faint rustling sound drew the attention of several canons seated in the choir stalls. They reported afterward that it was unlike the shifting of robes or the movement of air through the organ pipes, but instead carried the impression of a wing brushing stone. A single deep bell note followed, low enough to cause the great windows to vibrate slightly. Within moments, Archbishop Ferdinand faltered, his hands slipping from the altar, and he fell forward lifeless. The cathedral chapter officially attributed his death to age, as he was in his 72nd year. But privately, the senior canons sent a sealed report to Rome, noting the peculiar sequence of sound and shadow. The entry into the Black Ledger bears the phrase "in sede electorale," in the electoral seat, suggesting that the death of a prince archbishop under such circumstances carried heightened political weight. The Holy Roman Empire's intricate balance of secular and ecclesiastical authority meant that a sudden vacancy in an elector's seat was not merely a spiritual concern, but a matter of international diplomacy, further motivating the Vatican to control any narrative surrounding unexplained factors in his demise. In 1648, the phenomena appeared in Milan during a year already charged with political and religious tension. The city, under Spanish Habsburg rule, was celebrating the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, which would formally end the 30 Years' War. Archbishop Cesare Monti, a staunch defender of papal authority, presided over a grand Thanksgiving Mass at the Cathedral of the Nativity of St. Mary, better known as the Milan Duomo. Contemporary civic accounts record a cathedral filled with banners and lit entirely by tall beeswax candles. Despite the midday hour, a symbolic gesture of solemnity, according to the confidential Vatican report, the ceremony proceeded without disruption until the Te Deum, when a distinct shadow was seen gliding along the upper gallery above the choir. At least 3 witnesses described it as wing-like in shape, though no bird could have entered through the closed windows set high in the nave. A single resonant bell tone followed, too deep for the Duomo's existing set of bells, startling members of the choir. Moments later, Archbishop Monti's voice faltered. He gripped a crozier for balance, then collapsed beside the altar steps. He was declared dead almost instantly. The Spanish governor ordered the cathedral sealed and the witnesses sworn to silence, citing the need to prevent ill-omened rumors in a city already weary from decades of war. The nuncio in Milan sent a full account to Rome under seal, noting both the shadow and the bell tone as consistent with previous alla tacita incidents. The ledger entry for this case included the rare annotation post passum after peace, perhaps indicating that the appearance so soon after the war's conclusion was seen as an omen. The death of such a prominent figure at a moment meant to signal renewal only deepened the mystery for those few who knew the true pattern. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. By 1650, the ledger's custodians were recording alla tacita manifestations with a precision that suggested deliberate surveillance. That year, the phenomenon was documented in Vienna at St. Stephen's Cathedral during a Mass celebrated by Bishop Philip Friedrich von Breuner. The occasion was a solemn commemoration of the Habsburg victory at the Battle of Nördlingen 12 years earlier, a key Catholic triumph in the 30 Years' War. According to municipal records, the cathedral was crowded with nobles, military officers, and clergy. The confidential Vatican account states that during the bishop's homily, a sudden chill settled over the nave despite the summer heat. Several witnesses, including a canon stationed near the pulpit, saw a pale, indistinct form sweep along the triforium above the south aisle. Almost immediately, a single bell tone reverberated through the cathedral, lower than any note its bells could produce. Bishop von Breuner's speech faltered. He clutched the pulpit edge, turned his head sharply upward as though following something unseen, and then collapsed to the floor. Attempts to revive him failed. The official death notice cited apoplexy, but within days a sealed report was dispatched to Rome. The ledger's entry for this incident bears the notation "in sede imperii," in the seat of the empire, an indication of its geopolitical importance. The Habsburg court, protective of its public image, ensured that no mention of unusual phenomena appeared in printed accounts. Yet the Vatican archivist who handled the file noted the recurrence of the same key elements: the wing-like movement, the unaccountable bell tone, and the instantaneous death without visible cause. By mid-century, these reports painted a clear but unspoken picture for those who read the ledger. The silent wing moved freely across the Catholic world. From Iberia to the heart of Central Europe, its presence felt, but never openly named. In 1653, a striking case emerged from the city of Rouen in Normandy, then under the restored authority of the French crown. The Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Rouen, already centuries old, was hosting a visitation by Archbishop François de Harlay de Champvillon, a prominent figure in both court and ecclesiastical politics. The occasion was a solemn blessing for the newly refurbished choir stalls, carved with elaborate biblical scenes. Parish records confirm that the cathedral was filled with local dignitaries, merchants, and clergy. According to the confidential report sent to Rome, the service reached its midpoint without incident until the reading of the Gospel. Several congregants, including a canon seated near the archbishop, noticed a dimming of light along the upper vaults, despite the overcast daylight outside remaining constant. One witness swore that a faint shape, broad and indistinct, drifted along the clerestory above the altar. A deep bell note followed, reverberating for several seconds. The Rouen bells were silent by the sacristan's account. Moments later, the archbishop halted mid-sentence, his voice catching in his throat. He placed a hand to his chest and crumpled to the floor, lifeless before attendants could reach him. The official communiqué to Paris cited sudden natural causes. However, the nuncio's dispatch to the congregation of the Holy Office included specific mention of alla tacita and drew comparisons to earlier incidents in Milan and Cologne. The ledger's entry marked the case with in regno Franci, in the Kingdom of France, underscoring its national significance. The French monarchy, eager to avoid any narrative suggesting divine displeasure, quietly discouraged local discussion of the peculiar details. Yet for those maintaining the Vatican's Black Ledger, Rouen was simply another point on a widening map that tracked the passage of something unearthly and unrecorded in official history. In 1655, the ledger recorded an incident in Madrid that drew immediate attention in both Spain and Rome, due to the stature of those present. The royal monastery of San Lorenzo di El Escorial, built under King Philip II and serving as both palace and monastery, was hosting a grand mass attended by King Philip IV and the upper tiers of the Spanish court. The celebrant was Cardinal Baltasar de Moscoso y Sandoval, Archbishop of Toledo and Primate of Spain, a figure whose influence reached deep into the political and ecclesiastical life of the realm. Contemporary royal records confirm that the occasion marked the feast of St. Lawrence, the monastery's patron. According to the confidential Vatican account, the liturgy proceeded with full ceremonial splendor until the offertory, when several attendants reported a sudden unnatural stillness. One courtier described a faint pallor crossing the vaults above the altar, as if the light bent and shifted. Almost instantly, a deep bell tone sounded, resonating with a pitch no bell in the Escorial could match. The cardinal paused mid-prayer, turned his head sharply upward, and then collapsed to the marble floor. He died before the royal physician could reach him. The official accounts circulated in Madrid attributed the death to an unexpected seizure, with no mention of the peculiar shadow or the bell. However, the nuncio's detailed report to the Holy Office referenced alla tacita explicitly, noting its recurrence at events involving sovereign rulers. The ledger entry bears the annotation in Conspectu Regis Hispania, in the sight of the King of Spain. That the phenomenon appeared during so public and politically charged a liturgy underscored its indifference to human authority and its persistence in striking within the Church's most guarded spaces. In 1658, the phenomenon surfaced in Brussels, then under Spanish Habsburg control, during a liturgical celebration in the Cathedral of St. Michael and St. Gudula. The occasion was the installation of Bishop Alphonse de Burgos, a member of a prominent noble family with close ties to the Governor-General of the Spanish Netherlands. Civic records confirm that the cathedral was filled with both local aristocracy and representatives of the military garrison. According to the Vatican's confidential account, the Mass progressed without disruption until the moment of episcopal enthronement. Several witnesses in the nave reported a dim, shifting form passing high along the clerestory, its movements slow and soundless. Immediately afterward, a deep, singular bell tone rolled through the cathedral, its resonance markedly lower than the peal of the actual bells. Bishop de Burgos faltered as he rose from the enthronement chair, his expression fixed upward toward the vaults. He collapsed before completing the formal seating ritual and was declared dead within minutes. The official diocesan statement attributed the death to sudden illness brought on by the strain of the ceremony. However, the nuncio's private report to the Congregation of the Holy Office described the shadow and bell tone as consistent with other alla tacita manifestations noted in the ledger. The entry for this case bears the annotation "in inauguration," at the inauguration indicating the moment's ceremonial importance. The swift and discreet handling of the body, combined with the absence of any public acknowledgement of unusual events, suggest the cathedral chapter understood the political implications. For the ledger's keepers, Brussels represented another key point in the pattern, reinforcing the idea that the silent wing appeared at pivotal transitions of ecclesiastical authority, often in the presence of both secular and religious power. In 1661, the alla tacita was reported in Prague, then a vital Catholic stronghold within the Habsburg domains following the Counter-Reformation. The Church of St. Nicholas in the lesser town was hosting a high mass to commemorate the restoration of Catholic dominance in Bohemia after the 30 Years' War. Presiding was Archbishop Ernst Adalbert von Harrach, a figure deeply entrenched in imperial politics and a personal ally of the Habsburg court. Municipal accounts record the church as filled with clergy, noble families, and military officers. The confidential Vatican record notes that during the Sanctus, several canons saw a pale, indistinct form sweep across the upper gallery. It moved without sound, yet its passage seemed to draw the eye upward involuntarily. Almost immediately, a single bell tone resounded deep and resonant, beyond the capacity of the church's existing bells. Archbishop von Harrach's voice faltered mid-prayer. He grasped the edge of the altar as if to steady himself, then collapsed, dead before attendants could lift him. Official statements to the Prague City Council attributed his death to a sudden stroke. However, the papal nuncio's report to the Congregation of the Holy Office made explicit reference to alla tacita and compared the event to earlier occurrences in Vienna and Krakow. The ledger's notation for this entry reads, "in urbe coronata," in the crowned city, perhaps signifying Prague's dual status as a political and religious capital. The fact that the manifestation occurred in a city symbolizing Catholic victory over Protestant forces may have heightened the Vatican's caution, as public rumors linking the Archbishop's death to an ominous apparition could have been construed as a sign of divine disfavor. In 1664, the ledger records a case from Palermo, the principal city of the Kingdom of Sicily, then under Spanish rule. The Cathedral of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, long a focal point of civic and religious life, was hosting the annual feast of Saint Rosalia, Palermo's patron saint, credited with ending the plague of 1624. Archbishop Pietro Martinez y Rubio presided over the High Mass before an immense crowd, including the Viceroy's delegation. According to municipal chronicles, the celebration had proceeded with full processional pageantry, incense filling the aisles, and the cathedral bells ringing in ordered intervals. The confidential Vatican report states that during the Gospel reading, the interior light dimmed noticeably, though the Sicilian sun blazed outside. Several witnesses claimed to have seen a faint, sweeping movement above the altar canopy, its outline neither human nor entirely avian. Immediately following, a deep, singular bell tone rolled through the nave, reverberating long after the sound should have faded. Archbishop Martinez, mid-sentence, paused, looked upward sharply, and collapsed against the altar rail. Physicians rushed from the congregation, but could only confirm death. The official diocesan account attributed the incident to apoplexy. Yet the papal nuncio's dispatch to the Congregation of the Holy Office explicitly linked the event to alla tacita, noting its alignment with the established signs, the shadow's passage, and the anomalous bell tone. The ledger entry was annotated in festo patrone, on the patronal feast marking the importance of the day, that the manifestation occurred during a celebration tied to deliverance from plague may have carried uncomfortable symbolic implications, prompting the Church to suppress any connection between the Archbishop's sudden death and an otherworldly presence. Palermo thus joined the widening geographic record of appearances stretching from Iberia to Central Europe and now into the central Mediterranean. In 1667, the phenomenon was reported in Mexico City, the administrative and religious capital of New Spain. The Metropolitan Cathedral, then still under construction though already in use, hosted a grand liturgy to celebrate the Feast of the Assumption. The service was presided over by Archbishop Mateo de Sagad Buguero, a Galician prelate who had served as bishop in Spain before his appointment to the Americas. Colonial records confirm the attendance of the viceroy, members of the audiencia, and prominent clergy from across the region. The confidential Vatican account states that during the preface of the Mass, a sudden dimming fell across the sanctuary, described by several witnesses as though a cloud had passed indoors. One deacon claimed to see a pale shape gliding above the high altar, indistinct yet vast in outline. Moments later, a single low bell tone sounded impossible to match with the cathedral's existing bells, which were lighter and higher in pitch. Archbishop Sagad paused mid-prayer, gripped the altar for balance, and collapsed, dying instantly. The official colonial report cited natural causes, but the papal nuncio's coded letter to the Congregation of the Holy Office noted the similarity to previous alla tacita incidents in Europe. This marked the first recorded occurrence in the Americas entered into the ledger with the annotation transmare across the sea. Its appearance so far from the European heart of Catholicism was troubling to those who studied the ledger, for it indicated that the manifestation was not confined to the Old World's ecclesiastical centers. The inclusion of Mexico City, a seat of both secular and spiritual authority in the colonies, suggested that the silent wing's reach extended wherever the Church held sway, ignoring oceans and imperial boundaries alike. In 1670, the ledger records an incident from Naples, a city then part of the Spanish crown's Italian possessions. The Church of Gesù Nuovo, a prominent Jesuit stronghold renowned for its distinctive stone facade and richly adorned interior, was hosting a Mass for the feast of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Presiding was Father Girolamo Casati, provincial of the Jesuits in Naples, and an influential figure in the order's expansion throughout southern Italy. Parish records confirm the attendance of several noble families and senior officials from the Viceroy's court. According to the confidential Vatican report, the Mass proceeded with full ceremonial dignity until the communion rite. Several congregants near the transept reported a sudden shift in light above the altar, as if something immense had passed between the clerestory and the sanctuary lamps. One novice later testified privately that he had glimpsed what seemed like the arc of a pale wing before it dissolved into shadow. Immediately afterward, a single deep bell tone sounded, so resonant it seemed to vibrate through the marble columns. Father Casati, holding the ciborium, stopped mid-motion, his eyes fixed upward, then fell to the floor without a sound. Attempts at resuscitation failed. The official Jesuit communique to Rome mentioned only that he had died in the act of his ministry, omitting any account of the light or bell. However, a separate sealed letter from the Jesuit rector to the general in Rome directly referenced alla tacita and requested that the matter be handled solely through the Holy Office. The ledger's entry marked the case in Societate Jesu Neapoli, in the Society of Jesus at Naples, underlining both the order's involvement and the location. For the ledger's keepers, this was another confirmation that the phenomenon appeared without regard for rank, location, or distance from prior occurrences. In 1673, the phenomenon was documented in Vienna for the second time, this instance occurring within the Augustinian Church, long associated with the Habsburg court. The occasion was the wedding mass of Archduchess Maria Anna Josepha of Austria to Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine. The celebrant was Cardinal Sigismund von Kolonich, then Bishop of Wiener Neustadt, and a trusted figure in imperial service. Imperial archives confirm that the event was attended by Emperor Leopold I, members of the royal family, and a large gathering of nobility. According to the confidential Vatican account, the ceremony unfolded in a blaze of candlelight and music until the nuptial blessing. Several witnesses near the sanctuary reported a sudden dimming, though the candles did not flicker. One court chaplain stated in a sealed deposition that he saw a broad, pale movement in the air above the choir loft, slow and deliberate. Almost instantly, a deep single bell tone resounded, its pitch far lower than any bell in the Augustinian tower. Cardinal Kolonich paused mid-blessing, his voice breaking, and collapsed to the marble floor. He died before physicians from the imperial household could intervene. The official explanation given to the public was sudden heart failure brought on by age and exertion. However, the papal nuncio's private report to the Holy Office explicitly linked the event to alla tacita, noting that the manifestation had now been witnessed during a ceremony uniting two prominent Catholic dynasties. The ledger entry marked it in conspectu imperatoris in the side of the emperor, indicating the imperial significance. The recurrence of the phenomenon in Vienna, a city central to the Catholic defense of Europe, reinforced the impression that the silent wing appeared not at random, but during moments laden with symbolic and political weight. In 1676, the ledger records a case from Lima, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, and the most important Catholic center in South America. The Basilica Cathedral of Lima, standing on the Plaza Mayor, was hosting a grand liturgy for the feast of St. James, patron of Spain. Archbishop Melchor de Lignan y Cisneros, a man noted for his strict orthodoxy and administrative skill, presided over the Mass before an audience that included the Viceroy, members of the Audiencia, and visiting dignitaries from Quito and Cusco. Colonial accounts praised the solemnity of the service, yet the confidential Vatican record tells of an unsettling interruption. During the Credo, several canons and lay witnesses reported that the golden light spilling through the nave dimmed unnaturally, as though eclipsed from within. One altar boy swore under oath that he saw the faint curve of a wing-like form drifting above the main altar. Seconds later, a single deep bell tone rode through the cathedral, a note far lower than the cathedral's own bells could produce. Archbishop Lignan faltered mid-chant, placed a hand to his chest, and collapsed at the altar steps. He died before any blessing could be concluded. The official colonial bulletin attributed his death to natural causes, but the papal nuncio's encrypted dispatch to the Congregation of the Holy Office identified the signs as consistent with alla tacita. The ledger entry for this incident bears the annotation Insight Principalis Americae Australis, in the principal sea of South America, signaling its geographic significance. For the custodians of the Black Ledger, Lima's entry confirmed that the Silent Wings appearances across the Atlantic were not isolated events, but part of a deliberate and continuing pattern that ignored the barriers of oceans and continents. In 1679, the phenomena was reported in Paris at the Church of Saint-Sulpice, then newly constructed in parts, but already functioning as one of the city's most prominent parish churches. The occasion was a solemn mass, marking the return of the king from a military campaign, attended by members of Louis XIV's court and senior clergy from the Archdiocese of Paris. Presiding was Bishop François Harlay de Chambvalin, Archbishop of Paris, and a figure of considerable influence in both ecclesiastical and royal affairs. According to the confidential Vatican account, the liturgy had proceeded in full ceremonial splendor until the distribution of communion. Several attendees, including a canon stationed near the sanctuary, reported a sudden dimming across the upper reaches of the nave. One described it as a broad, pallid sweep that seemed to absorb the candlelight without casting a shadow. Almost immediately, a deep bell tone sounded its pitch markedly below that of Saint-Sulpice's bells. Bishop Harlay paused, lifted his gaze upward, and collapsed without warning. He died within moments, before the royal physician could approach. The official account issued in Paris cited heart failure, omitting any mention of unusual occurrences. However, the papal nuncio's private dispatch to the Congregation of the Holy Office explicitly linked the event to alla tacita, noting its troubling appearance in the capital of Catholic France during a moment of royal visibility. The ledger entry bears the notation in conspectu aule regiae in the sight of the royal court, underlining the potential political repercussions had the details been made public. For those who maintained the Black Ledger, Paris joined an expanding chain of significant cities where the Silent Wing's presence had coincided with the sudden deaths of the church's most prominent leaders. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. In 1682, the ledger records an incident in Rome itself, within the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the cathedral of the Pope as Bishop of Rome. The occasion was the annual celebration of the Feast of Corpus Christi, presided over by Cardinal Alderano Saibo, a senior figure in the Curia and trusted advisor to Pope Innocent XI. Contemporary accounts describe the basilica adorned with gold-embroidered banners and filled with incense so thick that it softened the shafts of sunlight from the clerestory. According to the confidential Vatican report, the procession had just returned to the high altar when a distinct pall fell over the sanctuary. Several canons later testified privately that they saw a dim arcing movement above the papal cathedra, vast and indistinct, gliding in silence. Moments later, a deep bell tone sounded, resonating so profoundly that some present felt it in their chests. Cardinal Saibo paused mid-blessing, his voice breaking, and collapsed backward into the grasp of an attendant priest. He died before being carried to the sacristy. The official communique issued by the Lateran chapter attributed the death to natural causes without further elaboration. However, the internal ledger entry included the rare notation in sed pontifia in the pontifical seat, marking the event's extraordinary significance. That the phenomenon manifested in the Pope's own cathedral during one of the Church's most important feasts underscored the audacity and reach of the Silent Wing. For the small circle of archivists entrusted with the Black Ledger, this case was a sobering reminder that proximity to the very center of Catholic authority offered no safeguard against its appearance. In 1685, the phenomenon was reported in Munich at the Frauenkirche, the Cathedral of Our Dear Lady, during a solemn mass attended by the Elector of Bavaria, Maximilian II, Emmanuel. The occasion was the feast of St. Michael, patron of both the city and the Bavarian state. Presiding over the liturgy was Archbishop Johann Franz von Wartenberg, a respected figure with close ties to both the Wittelsbach dynasty and the Holy See. According to the confidential Vatican account, the Mass proceeded with full ceremonial order until the moment of the Archbishop's homily. Witnesses in the choir loft and nave later described a sudden, inexplicable dimming of the cathedral's interior, though the clear autumn light still streamed through the great stained glass windows. One deacon, questioned privately afterward, claimed to have seen a broad, pale movement along the upper vaults, like a wing turned in slow flight. A single, deep bell tone followed, resonating for several seconds and unnerving even the most composed attendants. Archbishop Wartenberg hesitated mid-sentence, looked sharply upward, and collapsed where he stood. He was pronounced dead almost immediately. The official Bavarian court communique attributed his death to apoplexy and made no mention of unusual phenomena. However, the papal nuncio in Munich sent a sealed report to the Congregation of the Holy Office that directly identified the incident as another manifestation of alla tacita. The ledger entry bears the annotation in praesentia electoris, in the presence of the elector, underscoring the political visibility of the event. For those charged with guarding the ledger, Munich was yet another example of the Silent Wing's habit of appearing at ceremonies where both spiritual and temporal power converged, reinforcing the belief that its pattern was deliberate rather than random. In 1688, the ledger records an incident from Seville, one of Spain's most important ecclesiastical and mercantile centers. The Cathedral of St. Mary of the Sea, already famed for its vast Gothic interior and the towering Giralda, was hosting a high mass for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Presiding was Archbishop Jaime de Palafox y Cardona, a man with considerable influence in both the church and the court of Charles II. Civic chronicles note that the cathedral was crowded with merchants, nobles, and foreign envoys, drawn by the city's wealth and prominence. According to the confidential Vatican account, the liturgy progressed without interruption until the elevation of the host. At that moment, several witnesses reported that the golden light from the stained glass windows dimmed, as though veiled by an unseen shadow. A merchant seated near the transept swore that he saw a vast, pale curve drift across the upper vaults, silent but deliberate. Immediately afterward, a deep bell tone rolled through the nave lower and more resonant than any of the Giralda's bells. Archbishop Palafox's hands trembled as he held the host aloft. His eyes shifted upward for a fleeting second, then he collapsed before the altar. Death was instantaneous. The official diocesan statement described the event as a sudden illness brought on by the archbishop's frail health. Yet within 3 days, the papal nuncio in Madrid had sent a sealed packet to the Congregation of the Holy Office, identifying the signs as consistent with alla tacita. The ledger entry bears the notation in Regno Hispaniae Meridionale in the southern kingdom of Spain, marking the significance of the location. For the archivists of the Black Ledger, Seville confirmed that the silent wing appeared not only at political and liturgical high points, but also in cities that embodied the wealth and influence of Catholic empire. In 1691, the phenomenon was recorded in Lisbon, capital of the Portuguese Empire and a major hub of maritime trade and missionary activity. The Patriarchal Church, predecessor to Lisbon's later cathedral, hosted a high mass in honor of Saint Anthony of Padua, Portugal's most venerated saint. Presiding was Archbishop Luís de Souza, a senior ecclesiastical figure with close ties to the royal court of King Pedro II. According to the confidential Vatican record, the liturgy unfolded with solemn ceremony until the moment of the gospel reading. Several congregants, including 2 members of the royal guard, reported that the sunlight filtering through the nave dimmed abruptly, as if a great shadow had passed beneath the roof. One sacristan claimed to see a pale, wing-shaped arc move slowly above the sanctuary before fading into the gloom. A deep, singular bell tone followed, resonating with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor. Archbishop de Souza's voice caught mid-verse. He placed one hand on the pulpit for balance, looked briefly upward, and then collapsed before the altar. Death was confirmed within minutes. The official statement from the diocese attributed his passing to sudden apoplexy. However, the papal nuncio's encoded letter to the Congregation of the Holy Office described the signs as fully consistent with previous alla tacita manifestations, noting that this was the first recorded case in the Portuguese crown's primary seat. The ledger's notation for this event reads, "In Regno Lusitania, in the Kingdom of Portugal, marking its geographic and political importance." For the custodians of the Black Ledger, Lisbon's inclusion demonstrated that the silent wing's reach now spanned every major Catholic maritime power, from Spain to Portugal, striking at the heart of both colonial and ecclesiastical authority. In 1694, the ledger records an event in Antwerp, then part of the Spanish Netherlands, and one of Europe's most prominent trading cities. The Cathedral of Our Lady, known for its soaring spire and masterworks of Rubens, hosted a grand mass, marking the anniversary of the city's liberation from French occupation. Bishop Ambrosius Capello presided, accompanied by prominent merchants, military officers, and representatives of the Habsburg governor. The confidential Vatican account states that the liturgy was in full progression when the choir began the Sanctus. Without warning, the nave's interior dimmed in a way that could not be explained by the august daylight streaming through the stained glass. Several witnesses later testified privately that they saw a broad, pale movement sweep across the upper arches, its outline curved like a wing in slow descent. Immediately after, a deep, resonant bell tone echoed through the cathedral, far lower in pitch than any of its actual bells. Bishop Capello's voice faltered. He gripped the altar rail for support, fixed his gaze briefly upward, and then fell to the floor. He died almost instantly. The public explanation offered by the diocese was sudden illness aggravated by age. However, within a week, a sealed memorandum reached the Congregation of the Holy Office from the Papal Internuncio in Brussels, identifying the occurrence as consistent with the manifestations of alla tacita. The ledger entry included the notation in civitate mercatoria in the mercantile city, signaling that the appearance was tied to a place of significant economic and political influence. For the keepers of the Black Ledger, Antwerp served as further confirmation that the Silent Wing did not discriminate between political capitals and commercial hubs, striking wherever the Church's authority intersected with the visible centers of power. In 1697, the phenomenon was reported in Krakow for the second time, more than half a century after its first documented appearance there. The location was once again Wawel Cathedral, the coronation site of Polish kings and a symbolic heart of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The occasion was the funeral mass of Grand Headman Stanisław Jabunowski, a celebrated military leader who had fought against the Ottoman Empire. The presiding prelate was Bishop Jan Małachowski, an influential churchman with deep ties to the royal court in Warsaw. Contemporary chronicles describe the cathedral draped in black cloth and lit almost entirely by tall beeswax candles, despite the daylight outside. According to the confidential Vatican report, the service proceeded with great solemnity until the Libera Me chant. At that moment, several witnesses claimed to see a faint, sweeping form drift above the royal chapel, its outline unmistakably curved like a wing in slow motion. A deep, single bell tone followed, resonating in a way that caused the candles nearest the altar to flicker. Bishop Małachowski paused mid-prayer, his eyes moving upward as if following something unseen, and collapsed in full view of the assembled nobility. He was pronounced dead before the service concluded. The official diocesan statement attributed the death to a sudden seizure brought on by grief and age. Yet the papal nuncio's dispatch to the Congregation of the Holy Office explicitly identified the incident as alla tacita and noted its unsettling return to a city already marked in the ledger. The entry bore the notation Iterum Cracoviae again, in Krakow, underscoring the significance of a repeated manifestation in the same sacred space. For the ledger's custodians, it suggested that certain places might draw the Silent Wing more than once, as if bound to its path. In 1700, the ledger records an incident in Valletta, capital of the island of Malta and stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller. The setting was St. John's Co-Cathedral, the richly decorated Baroque masterpiece built by the order and dedicated to their patron saint. The occasion was the investiture ceremony for new knights, presided over by Grand Master Ramon Perillos y Rocafull, in the presence of Archbishop Davide Coco Palmieri. According to the confidential Vatican account, the nave was heavy with the scent of incense, sunlight glancing off gilded carvings and marble inlay. The service reached the solemn moment when the Archbishop raised his hands to pronounce the final blessing upon the new initiates. Witnesses in the upper galleries reported a sudden dimming of the light on the altar, though the Maltese summer sun still poured through the high windows. One knight, later questioned under seal, described seeing a pale, sweeping movement pass above the choir stalls, like a massive wing in near silence. Immediately afterward, a deep, resonant bell tone filled the cathedral, lower and fuller than any of its bells could produce. Archbishop Coco Palmieri froze mid-blessing, his eyes lifting toward the vaults, then collapsed to the polished marble floor. Death was instantaneous. The official statement issued by the order attributed the loss to a sudden collapse due to age, carefully omitting any reference to unusual occurrences. However, the nuncio's confidential report to the Holy Office noted the precise alignment of signs with alla tacita events elsewhere. The ledger's annotation for the case read, "In Insula Militum on the Island of the Knights," highlighting the political and symbolic importance of the site. For the Vatican's archivists, Valletta confirmed that even fortified centers of faith and military order were not immune to the reach of the silent wing. In 1703, the phenomenon was reported in Turin, capital of the Duchy of Savoy, during a high mass at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. The cathedral, famed for housing the Shroud of Turin, had drawn an unusual concentration of nobility and clergy that day, as Duke Victor Amadeus II himself attended alongside senior prelates. Presiding over the service was Archbishop Michelangelo della Chiesa, a man of considerable influence in Savoy's political and religious life. According to the confidential Vatican account, the liturgy proceeded without interruption until the moment of the elevation of the chalice. Several witnesses later claimed that the light within the nave dimmed abruptly despite the bright winter sun. A canon serving near the altar swore that he glimpsed a broad, pale arc above the high altar, motionless for an instant, then gliding out of sight. Immediately after, a deep bell tone rang through the cathedral, resonating at a pitch unknown to its actual bells. Archbishop della Chiesa's hands shook as he held the chalice aloft, his gaze flicking upward. Within seconds he collapsed, the chalice slipping from his grip and shattering on the marble floor. Death was declared moments later. The official statement released to the public attributed the archbishop's passing to sudden heart failure. Yet, the papal nuncio's sealed dispatch to the Congregation of the Holy Office explicitly referenced alla tacita and noted the added gravity of its appearance in a cathedral housing one of Christendom's most venerated relics. The ledger entry bore the notation in urbe sindonis, in the city of the shroud, a rare reference to a sacred object. For the keepers of the Black Ledger, the event in Turin raised uneasy questions about the connection between the silent wing and places bound to relics of exceptional importance. In 1706, the ledger records an incident in Brussels, marking the second known appearance of the phenomenon in that city. The setting was once again the Cathedral of St. Michael and St. Michael. Gudula, this time during a solemn Te Deum offered in thanksgiving for the city's survival after the siege by French forces during the War of the Spanish Succession. The Mass was celebrated by Bishop Humbertus Guillielmus de Principiano, Archbishop of Mechelen and Primate of the Low Countries, before an audience of military commanders, civic leaders, and the Habsburg governor's court. According to the confidential Vatican account, the cathedral was still scented with fresh laurel garlands placed in celebration, sunlight pouring in through the high Gothic windows. As the Archbishop began the Gloria, several canons seated in the choir noticed an abrupt dimming of the light, as if something vast and unseen had moved between the windows and the sanctuary. One choir member later testified in a sealed deposition that he glimpsed a pale, wing-like curve gliding silently across the vaulting. Almost immediately, a single deep bell tone reverberated through the cathedral, lower and more resonant than any of its bells. Archbishop de Principiano hesitated, his voice faltering mid-hymn, before collapsing to the floor before the high altar. Death was confirmed moments later. The official announcement attributed the loss to sudden illness brought on by strain and advanced age. Yet the nuncio's report to the Congregation of the Holy Office described the signs as perfectly consistent with alla tacita, noting the unsettling fact that this was the second occurrence in the same sacred space within 50 years. The ledger's notation read, Iterum Bruxellis again, in Brussels, suggesting to its custodians that some locations remained vulnerable to repeated visitations despite the passage of decades. In 1709, the phenomenon was recorded in Cologne, a city already marked once before in the ledger for an incident in the mid-17th century. This time the location was the Church of St. Maria, Im Capitol, one of Cologne's oldest Romanesque churches, renowned for its association with the city's early Christian heritage. The occasion was a special liturgy commemorating the anniversary of the city's deliverance from a plague outbreak decades earlier. Presiding was Archbishop Joseph Clemens of Bavaria, a powerful ecclesiastical prince whose influence extended across both the Rhineland and the imperial court. According to the confidential Vatican account, the church was brightly lit by candles, despite the morning sunlight, with banners of thanksgiving draped along the nave. During the recitation of the Te Deum, several witnesses reported a sudden, unnatural dimming of the space, as though a cloud had formed within the church itself. A lay brother standing near the pulpit claimed to see a pale, curved form drifting above the crossing, silent and deliberate. A single deep bell tone followed, resonating through the thick stone walls with a pitch far below that of any of Cologne's bells. Archbishop Joseph Clemens faltered mid-prayer, turned his head upward briefly, and collapsed at the foot of the altar steps. Efforts to revive him failed. The official communique from the archdiocese attributed the death to natural causes, citing fatigue from his recent travels. Yet the nuncio's sealed dispatch to the Congregation of the Holy Office stated plainly that the signs matched those of alla tacita and remarked upon his return to Cologne after decades of absence. The ledger entry was marked Iterum Colonia again in Cologne, reinforcing the suspicion among the ledger's keepers that certain cities, for reasons unknown, drew the silent wing back across centuries. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. In 1712, the ledger records an occurrence in Florence. Within the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the vast and iconic Duomo, crowned by Brunelleschi's dome. The occasion was the funeral mass of Grand Duke Cosimo III, de' Medici's younger brother, a ceremony attended by the Medici court, foreign ambassadors, and senior clergy from across Tuscany. Presiding was Archbishop Tommaso Bonaventura della Gherardesca, a man deeply involved in both ecclesiastical governance and the intricate political networks of the Italian states. According to the confidential Vatican account, the nave was heavy with incense, the light filtering through stained glass, casting deep reds and golds across the marble floor. As the Archbishop began the preface of the Mass, several witnesses noticed a sudden dimming of those colors, as though a veil of gray had passed over them. One sacristan later testified in private that he saw a pale, arcing form drift above the high altar, silent and impossibly large. Immediately, a deep, singular bell tone rolled through the Duomo, a resonance far deeper than any of its known bells. Archbishop della Gherardesca faltered mid-sentence, glanced upward, and collapsed. in full view of the Medici family. Death was instantaneous. The official ducal bulletin attributed the cause to an unexpected seizure. However, the papal nuncio's coded letter to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the signs as consistent with alla tacita, noting the gravity of such an appearance in Florence, the cradle of Renaissance Catholic culture and a city symbolic of papal influence in Tuscany. The ledger entry bore the annotation "In urbe Medicia," in the Medici city, underlining the political and dynastic weight of the setting. For the ledger's custodians, this case reinforced the idea that the silent wing often emerged in moments heavy with both ceremonial and symbolic significance. In 1715, the phenomenon was reported in Mexico City for the second time, more than 50 years after its first documented appearance there. The setting was again the Metropolitan Cathedral, now nearing completion after centuries of construction. The occasion was a solemn high mass, marking the coronation anniversary of King Philip V of Spain, attended by the viceroy, members of the Audiencia, military commanders, and leading clergy from across New Spain. Presiding was Archbishop José Lanciego y Eguilaz, a figure of considerable authority in both colonial governance and the Church. According to the confidential Vatican account, the midday sunlight streamed through the cathedral's high windows until, during the Sanctus, a strange dimness settled over the sanctuary. Several witnesses, including 2 deacons, later stated privately that they saw a pale, sweeping curve move above the high altar, silent and slow. A deep, resonant bell tone followed, vibrating through the floor in a way that none of the cathedral's bells could produce. Archbishop Lanciego hesitated, eyes fixed briefly upward, before collapsing at the altar steps. Death was declared within minutes. The official colonial bulletin attributed his passing to natural causes, citing his advanced age. Yet the papal nuncio's sealed dispatch to the Congregation of the Holy Office stated explicitly that the manifestation matched earlier alla tacita cases, noting with concern that this marked a repeated occurrence in the same cathedral. The ledger entry bore the notation "Iterum Mexici," again in Mexico City, indicating the site's reappearance in the record. For the ledger's keepers, this second manifestation in Mexico's most important ecclesiastical seat suggested that the silent wing was drawn back, generation after generation, to places where spiritual and temporal authority were most tightly bound. In 1718, the ledger records an incident in Palermo, marking the second known appearance of the phenomenon in that city. The location was once again the Cathedral of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and the occasion was the solemn opening of the Jubilee year, an event that drew thousands of pilgrims from across Sicily. Presiding was Archbishop Francesco del Giudice, a cardinal and former papal diplomat whose career had taken him from Madrid to Naples before his appointment in Palermo. According to the confidential Vatican account, the cathedral was filled to capacity, its chapels ablaze with candlelight despite the bright winter sun. During the reading of the Gospel, several canons in the sanctuary noticed the sudden fading of the light on the altar, though no clouds darkened the sky. One attendant swore in a sealed testimony that he saw a pale, wing-shaped form glide across the vaulting above the high altar. A deep, singular bell tone followed, resonating so powerfully that the carved wooden choir stalls seemed to tremble. Archbishop Del Giudice paused mid-verse, lifted his gaze upward, and then collapsed before the altar. He was pronounced dead moments later. The official statement from the archdiocese cited heart failure and made no mention of unusual phenomena. Yet the nuncio's encrypted letter to the Congregation of the Holy Office identified the event as entirely consistent with alla tacita and noted the troubling return of the manifestation to Palermo after more than half a century. The ledger's annotation read, "Iterum panormi again, in Palermo," reinforcing the suspicion among its keepers that certain cities held a lasting association with the silent wing, drawing it back long after the first appearance had faded from public memory. In 1721, the phenomenon was reported in Prague, the first recorded instance in the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia. The location was St. Vitus Cathedral, within the Prague Castle complex, a site deeply tied to both the Habsburg monarchy and the spiritual identity of the region. The occasion was a high mass celebrating the feast of St. Wenceslaus, Bohemia's patron saint, attended by nobles, foreign envoys, and senior clergy. Presiding was Archbishop Franz Ferdinand Quimberg, a prominent prelate whose tenure was marked by strong ties to the imperial court in Vienna. According to the confidential Vatican account, the service unfolded with full ceremonial grandeur until the Credo. At that moment, several canons and choir members reported an inexplicable dimming of the nave, as though a shadow had passed over the stained glass from inside rather than out. One verger later testified under seal that he glimpsed a vast, pale arc drifting above the choir, silent and deliberate. Immediately afterward, a deep bell tone rang through the cathedral, far lower than the pitch of St. Vitus's bells, and seemed to linger beyond the natural decay of sound. Archbishop Quimberg's voice faltered, his eyes lifting toward the vaulting before he collapsed to the marble floor. Death was instantaneous. The official report issued by the archdiocese attributed the cause to apoplexy. Yet the papal nuncio's encrypted message to the Congregation of the Holy Office stated clearly that the signs matched those of alla tacita and warned that its appearance in Prague, a city symbolic of both political and religious unity under the Habsburg crown, added to the manifestation's growing geographical breadth. The ledger's notation read, "In Regno Bohemia, in the Kingdom of Bohemia," marking it as a first, but potentially not a last. In 1724, the ledger records an incident in Vienna, marking the third known appearance of the phenomenon in that city. The setting was once again the Augustinian church, this time during the funeral mass of Empress Wilhelmine, Amalia's mother, Countess Maria Anna of Neuburg. The ceremony was attended by Emperor Charles VI, members of the imperial family, high-ranking nobles, and foreign ambassadors. Presiding was Cardinal Sigismund von Kolonich's successor, Cardinal Leopold Karl von Kolonich, a figure of both spiritual authority and political influence. According to the confidential Vatican account, the church was dimly lit in mourning, the air heavy with incense and the soft echo of the choir's chant. During the Libera Me, several witnesses reported that the dim candlelight seemed to fade further, though no draught disturbed the flames. One imperial chaplain later testified in sealed deposition that he glimpsed a pale, wing-like sweep above the imperial pew, slow and soundless. A deep, singular bell tone followed, resonating with such force that some mourners felt it in their chests. Cardinal Kolonich froze mid-prayer, turned his gaze upward for a brief moment, and then collapsed at the foot of the catafalque. Death was declared within moments. The official court announcement attributed the cause to sudden illness brought on by grief. Yet the papal nuncio's coded message to the congregation of the Holy Office identified the signs as those of alla tacita and noted the disturbing recurrence of the phenomena in the same church. Under circumstances involving imperial presence, the ledger entry bore the notation Tertio Vindo Bone, third time in Vienna, a rare triple occurrence for a single city. For the ledger's custodians, the Vienna record was proof that some locations, particularly those at the intersection of dynastic power and the church, drew the silent wing with unusual frequency. In 1727, the phenomenon was recorded in Dubrovnik, then the Republic of Ragusa, a wealthy maritime state on the Adriatic coast. The location was the Dubrovnik Cathedral of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, rebuilt after the devastating earthquake of 1667, and now a central symbol of the Republic's resilience. The occasion was a Thanksgiving Mass for the safe return of a Ragusan convoy from the Levant, attended by the rector, members of the Senate, foreign merchants, and senior clergy. Presiding was Bishop Simeone Fedeli, a respected figure known for his diplomatic skill in balancing Ragusa's independence between Ottoman and Venetian power. According to the confidential Vatican account, the midday sun streamed through the cathedral's new Baroque windows until, during the Gloria, a sudden dimming spread across the nave without any change in the weather outside. Several witnesses, including a senator, later testified under seal that they saw a pale, wing-shaped arc glide silently above the high altar. Almost immediately, a deep bell tone reverberated through the church, so low and sustained that it seemed to come from beneath the stone floor. Bishop Fedeli's voice faltered, and he looked briefly upward before collapsing to the marble steps of the altar. Death followed within moments. The official bulletin from the cathedral chapter cited heart failure. Yet, the papal internuncio's secret dispatch to the congregation of the Holy Office described the event in terms identical to earlier alla tacita manifestations, noting its significance in a fiercely independent Catholic republic. The ledger's notation read, "In civitate Ragusina," in the city of Ragusa, and was underlined twice, indicating the archivist's view that the silent wing's reach extended even into small but strategically vital Catholic enclaves that lay beyond the direct control of the great monarchies. In 1730, the ledger records an incident in Naples, a major cultural and political center of southern Italy under the rule of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty. The setting was the Naples Cathedral, dedicated to the Assumption of Mary and renowned as the resting place of Saint Januarius. The occasion was the annual festival celebrating the liquefaction of the saint's blood, a miracle that drew vast crowds from the city and beyond. Presiding was Archbishop Francesco Pignatelli, a cardinal with a long career in ecclesiastical diplomacy and a reputation for personal piety. According to the confidential Vatican account, the cathedral was filled to capacity, the air heavy with incense and the murmur of anticipation as the reliquary was displayed. As the archbishop began the solemn prayers, the daylight filtering through the clerestory windows dimmed unnaturally, though outside the skies remained clear. Several witnesses near the altar later swore in private depositions that they saw a vast, pale curve pass high above the nave, silent and slow-moving. Immediately afterward, a deep, resonant bell tone sounded lower than the pitch of any bell in Naples and lingered far longer than natural acoustics allowed. Archbishop Pignatelli hesitated, his gaze lifting toward the vaults, before collapsing beside the reliquary. death was pronounced almost instantly. The official statement issued by the cathedral chapter attributed the death to apoplexy. Yet the papal nuncio's coded message to the congregation of the Holy Office identified the event as a clear manifestation of alla tacita, noting the extraordinary symbolism of its occurrence during one of Christendom's most public and celebrated annual miracles. The ledger's annotation read, "In urbe miraculi," in the city of the miracle, a rare acknowledgement that the phenomenon had coincided with a site and occasion already bound tightly to the supernatural in the Catholic imagination. In 1733, the phenomena was reported in Lyon, France, within the Basilica of Saint Martin d'Ainay, one of the oldest churches in the city and a symbol of its deep Christian heritage. The occasion was a special mass marking the anniversary of Lyon's deliverance from famine, attended by civic leaders, prominent merchants, and clergy from across the archdiocese. Presiding was Archbishop Charles Joachim Colbert de Croissy, a member of the influential Colbert family that had long served the French crown. According to the confidential Vatican account, the basilica was illuminated by hundreds of candles despite the afternoon sun streaming through its Romanesque windows. As the archbishop began the Eucharistic prayer, witnesses described a sudden dimming of the candlelight that could not be explained by drafts or failing wicks. A canon seated near the altar later testified in secret that he saw a pale, wing-shaped form sweep silently across the apse, its arc impossibly large. Almost instantly, a deep, resonant bell tone rolled through the basilica, a sound unlike any of Lyon's bells, lasting several seconds beyond what natural reverberation would allow. Archbishop Colbert's voice faltered. He looked upward, his expression momentarily fixed, and then collapsed beside the altar rail. Death followed within moments. The public communique from the archdiocese cited a sudden collapse brought on by age and strain. Yet, the papal nuncio's encrypted letter to the congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the details as consistent with prior alla tacita manifestations, noting with concern that Lyon, a city positioned at the crossroads of European trade and ecclesiastical influence, now joined the expanding geographic pattern. The ledger entry bore the notation in urbe lugdunense in the city of Lyon, marking it as another strategic hub visited by the Silent Wing. In 1736, the ledger records an occurrence in Manila, capital of the Spanish Philippines, and the most distant colonial seat yet documented for the phenomenon. The location was Manila Cathedral, rebuilt after repeated earthquakes and storms, serving as the spiritual center for the entire archipelago. The occasion was a high mass celebrating the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, attended by the Governor General, members of the Real Audiencia, Spanish military officers, and leading clergy from across the islands. Presiding was Archbishop Juan Angel Rodriguez, recently appointed from Spain and known for his efforts to strengthen ecclesiastical authority in the colony. According to the confidential Vatican account, the tropical midday light streamed through the nave until, during the Sanctus, a sudden dimming fell over the altar, as though an immense shadow had passed within the church itself. Several witnesses, including a Dominican friar, testified privately that they saw a pale, wing-like sweep glide high above the sanctuary, silent and impossibly large. A deep, resonant bell tone followed, unlike the sound of any bell in the cathedral, lingering unnaturally in the air. Archbishop Rodriguez hesitated, looking briefly toward the vaults before collapsing to the marble floor. Death was declared on the spot. The official colonial communique attributed his passing to sudden illness exacerbated by the tropical climate. Yet the papal nuncio's report to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the event as consistent with alla tacita, noting the unprecedented range of its reach, now spanning from the centers of Europe to the far edge of the Catholic world. The ledger entry bore the notation in extremis Indies, in the far Indies, a rare phrase marking the sheer distance of the manifestation from Rome and reinforcing the belief among the ledger's custodians that no diocese was beyond its reach. In 1739, the phenomenon was reported in Avignon, a city with deep historical ties to the papacy from the era when it served as the seat of the popes in the 14th century. The setting was the Avignon Cathedral, dedicated to Our Lady of Doms, perched beside the former papal palace. The occasion was a solemn mass commemorating the feast of St. Peter, attended by local nobility, high-ranking clergy, and representatives of the papal legate. Presiding was Archbishop François-Marie de Manzi, a respected figure known for his scholarship and loyalty to Rome. According to the confidential Vatican account, the service proceeded under bright summer light, filtering through the cathedral's tall windows until, during the recitation of the Credo, an abrupt dimming fell over the nave without any change in the weather outside. Several canons in the choir later testified under seal that they saw a pale, sweeping arc pass silently over the sanctuary, vast and slow. Immediately afterward, a deep bell tone sounded lower and more resonant than any bell in Avignon, echoing in a way that seemed to press against the chest. Archbishop de Manzi's voice faltered. He looked upward briefly, as though tracking the unseen form, before collapsing near the altar rail. Death was instantaneous. The official communique attributed the cause to heart failure. Yet the papal legate's encrypted message to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the event as fully consistent with alla tacita, noting its particular significance in a city once directly governed by the Holy See. The ledger's notation read, "In urbe papali veteri," in the old papal city, a rare acknowledgement of Avignon's historic status. For the ledger's custodians, the appearance here seemed almost symbolic, as though the silent wing had returned to a place where papal authority had once been absolute. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here, subscribe. In 1742, the ledger records an incident in Brussels for the third time, an extraordinary recurrence in a single city. Once again, the setting was the Cathedral of St. Michael and St. Michael, Gudula, this time during a Te Deum, celebrating the birth of an heir to the Austrian Netherlands governor. The congregation included the Habsburg governor's court, military officers, leading merchants, and foreign diplomats. Presiding was Archbishop Thomas Philippe d'Alsace de Boussu, a prominent churchman with strong ties to Vienna. According to the confidential Vatican account, the cathedral was flooded with late summer light until, during the opening verses of the hymn, the illumination dimmed abruptly. Several canons later testified in sealed statements that they saw a pale, wing-like form sweep silently above the sanctuary, vanishing into shadow. A deep, resonant bell tone followed one that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the cathedral and lingered for several heartbeats longer than natural acoustics allowed. Archbishop d'Alsace paused mid-verse, his eyes fixed upward, then collapsed to the marble floor before the altar. he was pronounced dead within moments. The official diocesan communique attributed the event to sudden heart failure. Yet the papal internuncio's encrypted report to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the manifestation as alla tacita, noting with concern that Brussels now held the rare distinction of 3 separate appearances. The ledger's notation read, Tertio Bruxelles, 3rd time in Brussels, an annotation used only a handful of times in the entire record. For the ledger's custodians, this triple occurrence suggested not mere chance, but an enduring link between certain places and the phenomenon, as though the silent wing marked particular cities for repeated visitation across generations. In 1745, the phenomenon was reported in Salzburg, an ecclesiastical principality where the archbishop ruled both as a prince of the Holy Roman Empire and as spiritual leader of the territory. The setting was Salzburg Cathedral, a grand Baroque edifice dedicated to Saints Rupert and Virgilius. The occasion was the annual feast of Saint Rupert, founder of the city, drawing large crowds of clergy, townspeople, and visiting dignitaries. Presiding was Archbishop Leopold Anton von Firmian, remembered for his uncompromising policies and his expulsion of Protestant communities from the region decades earlier. According to the confidential Vatican account, the morning service began under a bright sky, the music of trumpets and choirs echoing through the cathedral. Yet during the Gloria, the interior dimmed suddenly in a way that could not be explained by clouds or failing light. Several witnesses, including 2 choir boys, swore in private testimony that they saw a pale, wing-like arc move slowly above the nave, passing without a sound. Immediately afterward, a deep bell tone rang out far lower than the cathedral's bells could produce and resonated in the air for several long seconds. Archbishop von Firmian's voice faltered, and he looked upward as though following something invisible. Moments later, he collapsed near the altar steps and was declared dead on the spot. The official announcement attributed his death to apoplexy, brought on by age and exertion. Yet, the papal nuncio's encrypted letter to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the occurrence as matching prior alla tacita events, noting the symbolic weight of its appearance in a prince-archbishopric, where secular and spiritual power were united in one figure. The ledger's notation read, In Principatu Archiepiscopali, in the Archiepiscopal Principality, marking Salzburg as a city of special dual authority visited by the Silent Wing. In 1748, the ledger records an incident in Seville, one of Spain's most important ecclesiastical and commercial cities, long enriched by trade with the Americas. The setting was the Seville Cathedral, the largest Gothic church in the world, and home to the tomb of Christopher Columbus. The occasion was a solemn mass celebrating the feast of Corpus Christi, attended by the city's archbishop, municipal leaders, high-ranking military officers, and foreign envoys. Presiding was Archbishop Francisco de Solís Folch de Cardona, a cardinal with extensive connections to the Spanish crown. According to the confidential Vatican account, the summer morning sunlight poured through the cathedral's immense stained glass until, during the elevation of the host, an inexplicable dimness descended. Several witnesses, including a canon stationed near the choir, later testified under seal that they saw a pale, sweeping form pass high above the altar, moving in silence. Almost immediately, a deep, resonant bell tone rang out lower and fuller than any bell in the cathedral and seemed to vibrate through the massive stone columns. Archbishop de Solis froze, his gaze lifting toward the vaults before collapsing at the foot of the altar. Death was declared within minutes. The official statement issued by the archdiocese cited sudden heart failure, making no mention of the strange light or sound. Yet the papal nuncio's encrypted message to the congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the signs as consistent with alla tacita, noting the gravity of such a manifestation in a city that once served as the spiritual and administrative gateway between Spain and its overseas empire. The ledger's notation read, "In portu imperi," in the port of the empire, a reminder to the ledger's custodians that the silent wing often appeared where global trade, political power, and the church converged. In 1751, the phenomena was reported in Milan, the first recorded instance in that city. The setting was the Milan Cathedral, still under construction, yet already one of Europe's largest churches, dominating the city's central square. The occasion was a high mass marking the feast of St. Ambrose, Milan's patron saint, attended by civic leaders, prominent merchants, and visiting clergy from across Lombardy. Presiding was Archbishop Giuseppe Pozzobanelli, a cardinal known for his reformist views and careful diplomacy with both Austrian and papal authorities. According to the confidential Vatican account, the winter sunlight filtered through the vast windows until, during the chanting of the Sanctus, the interior light dimmed sharply. Several witnesses later testified in private that they saw a pale, wing-like curve drift above the choir, silent and immense. A deep, resonant bell tone followed, unlike the sound of any of the cathedral's bells, lingering long enough to be felt as much as heard. Archbishop Pozzobanelli faltered in his chant, looked upward for a brief moment, and collapsed to the marble floor before the altar. Death was pronounced moments later. The official diocesan announcement attributed the cause to a sudden seizure. Yet the papal nuncio's encrypted report to the congregation of the Holy Office described the event in precise alignment with previous alla tacita manifestations, noting its significance in a city of both political and economic weight within the Habsburg domains. The ledger entry bore the notation in Urbe Mediolanense in the city of Milan, marking it as a strategic addition to the expanding geographic map of the phenomenon. For the ledger's keepers, Milan's entry underscored the growing sense that the silent wing sought out cities of enduring influence, whether their power rested in faith, politics, or commerce. In 1754, the ledger records an incident in Antwerp, a city once among Europe's greatest trading ports and still a vital center for commerce and art in the Austrian Netherlands. The location was the Cathedral of Our Lady, a towering Gothic structure famed for its Rubens altarpieces. The occasion was the installation mass for a newly appointed canon, attended by merchants, guild leaders, and high-ranking clergy. Presiding was Bishop Guillaume Philippe de Herzels, a respected churchman known for his administrative skill and close connections to Brussels. According to the confidential Vatican account, the afternoon sun bathed the cathedral in warm light until, during the Gloria, that brightness dimmed abruptly, not as if from passing clouds, but as if something immense had moved within the nave. Several witnesses later gave sealed testimonies, describing a pale, wing-shaped sweep crossing high above the sanctuary, silent and deliberate. A deep, resonant bell tone followed one entirely unlike the sound of the cathedral's bells lingering in the air longer than natural reverberation could allow. Bishop de Herzels paused mid-prayer, lifted his gaze toward the vaults, and collapsed at the foot of the altar. Death was declared on the spot. The public statement from the diocese attributed his passing to apoplexy. Yet, the papal internuncio's encrypted message to the Congregation of the Holy Office identified the event as fully consistent with alla tacita, noting with unease its appearance in Antwerp, a city that for centuries had been a crossroads of wealth, faith, and political intrigue. The ledger's notation read, "In portu mercatorum," in the port of merchants, underscoring for the ledger's custodians the pattern of the Silent Wing's manifestations in cities that combined religious significance with commercial power. In 1757, the phenomenon was reported in Krakow, the historic capital of Poland and a long-standing center of Catholic scholarship and pilgrimage. The setting was Wawel Cathedral, burial place of Polish kings and saints, perched atop the hill within the fortified Wawel complex. The occasion was a solemn mass celebrating the feast of St. Stanislaus, attended by the city's bishop, nobles, scholars from the Jagiellonian University, and throngs of pilgrims. Presiding was Bishop Kajetan Soltyk, a rising figure in the Polish episcopate known for his eloquence and political influence. According to the confidential Vatican account, the spring daylight illuminated the Gothic and Renaissance chapels until, during the reading of the Gospel, the brightness dimmed in a way that none present could attribute to passing weather. Several witnesses later testified in sealed statements that they saw a pale, sweeping arc move slowly above the high altar, vast and silent. A deep, resonant bell tone followed, one that seemed to vibrate through the marble floor and linger unnaturally long. Bishop Soltyk's voice faltered. He glanced upward briefly, then collapsed in full view of the congregation. Death was pronounced moments later. The official cathedral announcement cited sudden illness. Yet the papal nuncio's encrypted letter to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the signs as entirely consistent with alla tacita, noting with particular weight the symbolic significance of its appearance in a cathedral tied so closely to Poland's royal and saintly heritage. The ledger's notation read, "In Regia Poloniae," in the royal city of Poland, marking Krakow as another location where religious devotion, national identity, and political authority met, and thus another fitting stage for the Silent Wing's visitation. In 1760, the ledger records an incident in Quebec City, marking the first known appearance of the phenomena in North America outside Spanish territories. The location was the Cathedral Basilica of Notre Dame de Quebec, the seat of Catholic authority in New France, recently restored after years of wartime damage during the 7 Years' War. The occasion was a high mass of thanksgiving for the safe arrival of supply ships from France, attended by the bishop, colonial officials, military officers, and prominent local families. Presiding was Bishop Henri-Marie Dubreuil de Pontbriand, a respected leader who had guided the diocese through hardship and conflict. According to the confidential Vatican account, the crisp spring light streamed through the cathedral's windows until, during the chanting of the Sanctus, an abrupt dimming fell across the nave, as though an unseen presence had passed through the space. Several witnesses, including a Jesuit missionary, later testified under seal that they saw a pale, wing-like form sweep high above the sanctuary, gliding in silence. Almost immediately, a deep, resonant bell tone sounded unlike the pitch of any bell in Quebec, reverberating with unnatural length. Bishop Pontbriand hesitated, lifted his eyes toward the vaulting, and collapsed beside the altar steps. Death was confirmed within moments. The official colonial communique attributed the cause to a sudden seizure. Yet the papal vicar's encrypted message to the congregation of the Holy Office identified the event as consistent with alla tacita, noting its particular significance as the phenomenon's first documented occurrence in France's North American dominions. The ledger's notation read, "In Nova Francia," in New France, a rare acknowledgement that even the most distant colonial dioceses were not beyond the reach of the Silent Wing. In 1763, the phenomenon was reported in Lisbon, a city still marked by the devastation of the great earthquake of 1755, yet determinedly rebuilt into a new capital of Enlightenment ideals and imperial power. The location was the patriarchal cathedral of St. Mary Major, the restored say of Lisbon, standing as both a symbol of resilience and the seat of Portugal's archbishop. The occasion was a solemn mass of thanksgiving for the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War. Attending were members of the royal family, foreign diplomats, and senior clergy. Presiding was Patriarch Francisco de Saldana da Gama, a cardinal and influential advisor to the crown. According to the confidential Vatican account, the late winter light filled the nave until, during the Credo, an unnatural dimming occurred, as though a vast shadow had formed within the building. Several witnesses, including a royal chaplain, later gave sealed testimonies, claiming they saw a pale, sweeping form move high above the sanctuary, silent and immense. A deep, resonant bell tone followed, far lower than the pitch of the cathedral's bells, reverberating so strongly that it seemed to press against the chest. The patriarch faltered mid-prayer, lifted his eyes toward the vaulted ceiling, and collapsed at the altar rail. Death was declared moments later. The public bulletins cited apoplexy as the cause. Yet the papal nuncio's encrypted dispatch to the congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the manifestation as alla tacita, noting the symbolic significance of its appearance in Lisbon, a capital whose reach extended across continents through its empire. The ledger's notation read, "In capite imperii Lusitani," in the capital of the Portuguese Empire, reinforcing the pattern of the Silent Wing's preference for places where global influence and ecclesiastical authority intertwined. In 1766, the ledger records an incident in Edinburgh, marking one of the rare appearances of the phenomenon in a predominantly Protestant realm. The setting was St. Mary's Chapel, a small but long-established Catholic mission in the city, operating discreetly under the restrictions imposed by British law. The occasion was a private mass for the Feast of the Assumption, attended by a handful of Catholic gentry, visiting clergy from the continent, and members of the local mission community. Presiding was Father Alexander Geddes, a learned priest known for his pastoral care and cautious diplomacy in a climate often hostile to open Catholic worship. According to the confidential Vatican account, the summer afternoon light filtered through the narrow windows until, during the Sanctus, a sudden dimness fell across the chapel interior. Several present later gave sealed testimonies, claiming they saw a pale, curved form pass silently over the altar, moving so slowly it seemed to hover. Immediately afterward, a deep, resonant bell tone sounded far beyond the range of any bell in the city and lingered unnaturally in the air. Father Geddes paused, eyes lifting toward the vaulted ceiling, before collapsing before the altar steps. Death was confirmed within minutes. The official explanation circulated quietly within the mission attributed his passing to heart failure. Yet a Jesuit envoy's coded letter to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the event as consistent with alla tacita, noting with significance that the manifestation had occurred in a city where Catholicism existed largely in secrecy. The ledger's annotation read, "In urbe heretica," in the heretic city, a rare and pointed remark, suggesting that even the most marginal Catholic enclaves in hostile territory were not beyond the reach of the silent wing. In 1769, the phenomenon was recorded in Valletta, capital of the island of Malta and seat of the Knights Hospitaller, one of the most formidable Catholic military orders in history. The setting was St. Co, John's Co-Cathedral, a richly decorated Baroque masterpiece built by the Knights as a testament to their devotion and power. The occasion was a solemn mass marking the anniversary of the Great Siege of 1565, attended by the Grand Master, senior knights in full regalia, foreign dignitaries, and high clergy. Presiding was Bishop Giovanni Carmine Pellerano, the order's spiritual leader in the diocese. According to the confidential Vatican account, the midday sun illuminated the cathedral's gilded vaults until, during the Te Deum, a sudden dimming occurred without any natural cause. Several witnesses, including 2 knights of high rank, testified under seal that they saw a pale, sweeping arc pass above the sanctuary, vast and utterly silent. Immediately afterward, a deep bell tone resonated far lower and heavier than the cathedral's great bells and lingered as though time itself had slowed. Bishop Pellerano's voice broke. He glanced upward briefly before collapsing in front of the altar. Death was declared almost instantly. The official communique from the order attributed his passing to natural causes, with no mention of the strange phenomena. Yet the papal nuncio's encrypted message to the Congregation of the Holy Office confirmed the case as alla tacita, noting the symbolic potency of its occurrence in the heart of a Catholic military order that had long styled itself as a defender of Christendom. The ledger's notation read, "In Insula Militia Sacri," on the island of the Holy Militia, closing the 18th century section of the record with a manifestation at one of the most martial and devout sites in the Catholic world. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.